When my father first brought Savannah into our home, I didn't pay much attention to it. She seemed so proper, always polite, reserved, as if she were trying to fit the role of the perfect wife and stepmother. However, after a few months, I began to notice something more human, more vulnerable in her. When my father left on another 2-week business trip, it was just the two of us, and those evenings took on an entirely different hue. I remember us sitting on the veranda on that hot summer evening. Savannah held a glass of white wine in her hand, her fingers lazily tracing the rim of the glass, and in the dim light of the street lamp, it felt like I was seeing her in a new light. She asked about my future plans, and I started talking about my work, about how I dreamed of creating something meaningful that would remain after me. I expected standard phrases of support, but Savannah listened attentively, asked questions, showed genuine interest. I felt something growing between us, something more than simple understanding. We talked until it was completely dark. Suddenly, Savannah laughed, loudly, sincerely, as if she had broken through the invisible wall that always stood between us. "You're so smart, Jake," she said, and I felt warmth wash over me from her words. I looked at her and saw not just my father's wife, but a woman who was alive, real, someone I wanted to be closer to. That evening, our hands accidentally touched when she reached out to pour me another glass of wine. It was a brief, almost innocent touch, but in that moment, I felt a spark flicker between us, and her glance was enough to make me drop all my masks. I looked away, but the sensation of her fingers on my skin lingered long after. When the clock struck midnight and we finally decided to part ways, Savannah lingered in the doorway, as if she wanted to say something. Her lips parted, but the words got stuck somewhere in the air, unspoken, invisible. "Good night, Jake," she whispered softly and walked away, leaving me in the darkness, alone with my thoughts. I stood by the window for a long time, watching her climb the stairs, unable to understand what was happening. It was like a lightning flash in a clear sky, unexpected, sudden, but all the more captivating for it. Something had changed that evening, and I knew there was no turning back. The next day, I tried to keep myself busy, to distract myself from thoughts of her, but it was futile. Every time Savannah appeared in my line of sight, my heart raced. I knew I should forget about last night, but it was impossible. It was like trying to hold sand through my fingers. The harder I tried, the more I felt her presence. I couldn't have known then that that touch, that simple night on the veranda, would mark the beginning of something that would change us both. The next evening, I tried to keep myself busy, distracting myself from the thoughts of what had happened on the veranda. My father was on a business trip, and the silence in the house heightened the sense of emptiness. I started a movie, hoping it would divert my attention, but thoughts of Savannah kept creeping back, no matter how hard I tried. Closer to midnight, I heard her footsteps. Savannah entered the living room, and in the dim light from the TV, I noticed something unfamiliar, something unusual in her eyes. She looked worried, but as if having made a decision, she sat down next to me, even though the room had plenty of other seats. We sat in silence for a while, and in that moment, I felt our hearts beating in the same rhythm, as if something common was binding us that evening. "I wanted to talk about yesterday." Her voice was soft but confident. She looked at me as if she were trying to find answers to her own questions, and I felt the air around us become thick, electric. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she added, but there was no regret in her voice, only doubt and something like hope. "Do you feel it too?" I blurted out before I could stop myself. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked so vulnerable, so real. We were sitting so close that I could smell the faint scent of her perfume enveloping me, awakening something deep and subconscious within. "It's wrong," Savannah whispered, but she didn't pull away. She took that step, and it was already an acknowledgement of what was happening between us. I don't remember how it happened, but at some point our gazes met, and everything I had tried so hard to suppress flared up with new intensity. We reached for each other as if seeking salvation in that moment, and when our lips finally touched, time stood still. The kiss was uncertain, cautious, like the first touch of something forbidden and fragile. I felt her hand on my cheek, a gentle touch that made me forget everything else in the world. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to turn everything inside out. I stepped back first, trying to catch my breath as if I had just run a marathon. "Savannah, this..." I began but couldn't finish. Words got lost in the whirlwind of thoughts and emotions that overwhelmed me. "I know," she whispered, looking away. She stood up, and for a moment, I thought she would just leave, that this moment would remain only in my memory. But she paused in the doorway, looked at me over her shoulder and said, "This shouldn't happen again, Jake." I remained sitting in the darkness, watching her silhouette dissolve into the shadows of the hallway. Her words echoed in my head, but it felt like it wasn't the end. That evening I realized that we had crossed a line and there was no turning back. After that kiss, I began to avoid her gaze. All day long I tried to find something to occupy myself, pushing away thoughts of what had happened, but it was all in vain. We became like two strangers living under the same roof. I could feel her moving around the house, lingering at the door of my room a second longer before leaving. This invisible magnet between us was pulling stronger than ever. One evening, I returned from my run and found the kitchen light on. Savannah stood at the table, sorting through documents, looking lost in her thoughts. I wanted to slip by unnoticed, but she saw me. "Jake," she said unexpectedly, and I froze. "We need to talk." "About what?" My voice sounded dry, but inside, I felt my heart pounding as if it were about to burst from my chest. She stepped closer, and I felt the light touch of her hand on mine. "About what's happening between us," she said softly. "It's wrong. You know it yourself." "Then why can't we just stop?" I asked, not taking my eyes off her. "Why can't you leave?" "Because it's not that simple." Her voice trembled, as if she were trying to hold herself back from saying too much. "Because I can't forget that moment. That kiss." Savannah stood so close that I could see the reflection of my eyes in her gaze. I wanted to ask why she wasn't leaving, why she stayed here when everything had become so complicated. But before I could utter a single word, she reached out to me and her lips touched mine again. This time, the kiss was different. There was no uncertainty, only a desperate need to find answers to the questions we had been too afraid to ask. I embraced her, pulling her closer, feeling the warmth of her body and the beating of her heart matching my own. For a few seconds, the entire world disappeared, leaving only the two of us, consumed by the moment. We shouldn't," she said as we pulled apart, her breath shaky and her eyes glistening with tears. "It's too dangerous, Jake." "Then why did you come back?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Why did you come back to me?" "Because I feel the same way you do," Savannah replied, her confession hanging in the air, enveloping us like an invisible net. "But it doesn't change anything." We stood like that for a few more minutes, both understanding that what had happened between us could no longer be ignored. Finally, she turned toward the exit, but before leaving, she said, "This has to end, Jake, before we go too far." I watched her walk away, feeling this moment etch itself into my memory like an unhealing wound. I knew she was right, but I also knew that I couldn't stop. The first drops of rain tapped against the roof as I sat on the back porch, watching the gray clouds slowly swallow the evening sky. A few days had passed since our last conversation, and since then, a silence hung between Savannah and me, thick with tension. Time seemed to stand still, turning every glance, every word into something significant, like a hidden code understood only by the two of us. I shivered as I heard the creak of the door behind me. Savannah approached, wrapped in a thin blanket, and sat down beside me in silence. Her hair was slightly damp from the rain, and she looked tired, as if all her energy had gone into keeping everything under control. We didn't speak, just sat there listening to the rain intensify and watched the droplets slide down the steps of the porch. "I thought I could forget." She finally broke the silence, not raising her eyes. "But it's like a shadow that follows me everywhere." "You're not alone," I replied, and my voice carried more despair than I had expected. "I can't get rid of it either." Savannah turned to me, her gaze piercing me to the core. There was something in her eyes that made me realize she felt the same struggle inside. "Jake," she whispered, as if trying to find the right words, "what are we doing?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know one thing, I can't stop. even if I wanted to. We fell silent again, and I noticed her hands nervously fiddling with the edge of the blanket. In that moment, everything that separated us vanished, and I reached out to cover her palm with mine. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand, intertwining our fingers as if she wanted to feel that this was real, not just a dream. "Tell me this is a mistake," she softly pleaded. But there was no certainty in her voice, only hope. "Tell me we can just forget." "I can't," I confessed, and in that moment I realized we were standing on the edge, on a brink that separated us from falling into the abyss. Inside, everything screamed that this was wrong, but I couldn't resist anymore. Savannah slowly leaned towards me, her lips hovering an inch from mine. I felt her breath, light and uneven, and it was all I needed to forget about common sense. I pulled her closer and we kissed again, but this time there was no doubt, no hesitation. It was a moment in which we finally found each other. Her hand touched my cheek and I felt her tremble. This kiss wasn't just an expression of forbidden desire. It held everything we had kept inside for so long, all the words we were afraid to speak aloud. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads touched, and I felt her tears brush against my skin. "We can't," she whispered, trying to bring reality back into our world. But her voice sounded as broken as mine. "We shouldn't." "But we already did," I replied softly, knowing there was no turning back. The days that followed that rainy evening seemed to stretch endlessly. We both knew that something had changed, but neither of us dared to voice it aloud. We still clung to that fragile illusion that we could turn everything back to the way it was. But deep down, I understood that it was impossible. I sensed that Savannah felt the same way. One evening, I returned home later than usual and found her in the kitchen. Savannah was sitting at the table, a cup of tea in front of her, but she didn't even touch it. Her gaze was fixed on nothingness, and I noticed a slight twitch of her lips, as if she were trying to decide something very important for herself. "Jake," she said when I entered the room. There was a determination in her voice that hadn't been there before. "We need to talk." I sat across from her, feeling my heart tighten in my chest. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I knew those were the very words I'd been dreading to hear. "I've made a decision," Savannah began, her voice steady as if she had rehearsed it countless times in her mind. "I'm leaving." The words caught in my throat, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Why?" I asked, though I understood the answer all too well. "Is it because of us?" She nodded. "It can't go on like this. We've gone too far, and I can't allow myself to destroy everything around me, to ruin your life." I wanted to argue, to say that we could find a solution, that we could be together, but I knew she was right. We had indeed crossed a line, and there was no turning back. "When?" was all I could manage to ask. "Tomorrow morning," she replied, and I felt something inside me break. "I've already prepared everything." Savannah stood up, ready to leave, but I grabbed her hand. "Don't go," I pleaded before I could stop myself. "Not now." She looked at me, and I saw tears glistening in her eyes. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you have to let me go." "But how?" I responded, realizing I couldn't imagine my life without her. "How can I just let you go after everything?" "Because it's the right thing to do," she said softly, gently releasing her hand from mine. "We need to forget all of this to preserve what little we have left." She leaned in and touched my lips one last time, and in that farewell kiss, there was more than just goodbye. It was a moment where we surrendered all the unspoken words, all the dreams that would never come true. When she pulled away, I understood that this was truly the end. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a car leaving the driveway. I rushed outside, but it was too late. Savannah was gone, and there was no trace of her car on the road. I stood there, feeling the cold wind brush against my face, realizing that it was all over. Years have passed since then, but I still remember her. Sometimes I catch myself searching for her face in a crowd or listening for her laughter, as if hoping that one day we might meet again. But perhaps the true essence of our story lies in the fact that we let go of those we love to give them the chance to find their own happiness.